All right, let's dive in to a dusty tome. Dusty tome. Let's do some book learning. All right, let's dive in. All right, let's do some book learning. Welcome to part 2 of my reading of Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technetronic Era. I kept saying ages last time, but it is era. Whoops. I'm going to jump right into the reading, but first I do want to do a little bit of a backgrounder just on the general topic. The first clip is going to be information heavy with a bunch of names. If you want to pause and look up, there's a lot of good data on here. And then the next clip is just going to be kind of laying out what it is, matter of factly in plain English. I appreciate you taking this dive with me. This book is thick. It's not long, but the words are thick and they're hard to parse and process and understand. And I appreciate you taking this journey with me to educate and learn and understand where we're at and how we got here. And just so you know, the tool that I'm using here is Clip Genie for a podcast called Grand Theft World, which is a great source of information, including their sister podcast, the Peace Revolution podcast. But let's go ahead and dive in to the Grand Theft World podcast for a quick clip or two, and then we'll dive directly into the reading. Let's go.
Yeah,
Macy conferences. There's a MK Ultra type of that's not for this.
Postmodern philosophers.
I don't know what would happen
embedded within the idea of cybernetics and transhumanism and relativism.
I think everyone should just start here. Start with Umpleby.
Yeah,
Professor Umpleby. Here, he's got a 6-hour tutorial,
before, but it's good. It's very good. Yeah.
Cybernetics then and now. Macy conferences. Von Forster, Bateson, Soros, and these guys. This is the Technetronic era. This is. You want to look at the grandfathers of technocracy, they're right here. And George Soros just adopted what they were doing.
Also, check out All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, episode 2, the use and abuse of vegetational concepts, I believe. It goes into the Macy conferences as well. And it's like an hour-long part of a 3-part documentary series. It's an hour long, the second episode.
Yeah, I mentioned Michelle Sindona earlier today in the Blackfriars Bridge incident, because I talked about John Paul I as do popes retire? I thought they all worked until they died. Societa Generale Immobiliare, George Soros and Michelle Sindona and some Rhodes Scholars over there. There might be a French connection.
You're living in a world that is actively being ruled by dark occultists who are completely enslaving people through mind control. That's where we live. And they do that through their communications and publishing technologies to get those ideas firmly embedded in your shit for brains mind. And they are very successful at that. That's why I call them a technological or technotronic occultocracy. They're a technocratic occultocracy.
All right, let's dive in. Social explosion / implosion. This new relationship is a tense one. Man has still to define it conceptually and thereby render it comprehensible to himself. Our expanded global reality is simultaneously fragmenting and thrusting itself in upon us. The result of the coincident explosion and implosion is not only insecurity and tension, but also an entirely novel perception of what many still call international affairs. I really like how he words the man has still to define it conceptually and thereby render it comprehensible to himself. This is like explaining the mental and logical processes that people go through that they don't really think about. But if you can't define something conceptually, then you can never comprehend it. And so it's always sort of out of grasp. And I think that's how a lot of these people operate using government, using these control systems. They keep the words and the knowledge from you so that they can operate in a way that you can't even comprehend it. So you can never grasp at it and stop it or choose something different because you can't even put it into words what is happening to you. It's incomprehensible and conceptually outside of your framework. And that's why it's so important to take the time to read things, to reflect on things, to learn a system like the Trivium that lets you break down and understand how you learn, so that you can look at it from a third person perspective and say, how do I know this? Do I even really know this? What does it mean to know, to really understand something? Just because someone told me something, does that mean I know it? That it's really important, because these people who write this book, Zbigniew, he understands the Trivium. He understands logic and rhetoric and how to gather proper grammar and use words as a weapon. He understands all these things so that he can run circles around the average person. Life seems to lack cohesion as environment rapidly alters and human beings become increasingly manipulable and malleable. What was I saying? Manipulating. Everything seems more transitory and temporary, external reality more fluid than solid, the human being more synthetic than authentic. Even our senses perceive an entirely novel reality, quote unquote, one of our own making, but nevertheless, in terms of our sensations, quite real. I mean, what is he describing other than entertainment, video games, the internet, virtual reality? Even social media is itself a virtual reality. It's a hyper reality. It's not actually what's happening. It's not actually people's lives. It's a hyper realized, mediated version that isn't quite real. More important, there is already widespread concern about the possibility of biological and chemical tampering with what has until now been considered the immutable essence of man, or coronaviruses. Human conduct, some argue, can be predetermined and subjected to deliberate control. Man is increasingly acquiring the capacity to determine the sex of his children, to affect through drugs the extent of their intelligence, and to modify and control their personalities. I mean, determine the sex of your children, is that not a hot issue right now? Speaking of a future at most only decades away, an experimenter in intelligent control asserted, an experimenter in intelligence control asserted, intelligence control? Wait, someone is in intelligence control. Is that a job that you can get? You can be in intelligence control? I need to control your intelligence. Speaking of a future at most only decades away, an experimenter in intelligence control asserted, I foresee the time when we shall have the means and therefore inevitably the temptation to manipulate the behavior and intellectual functioning of all the people through environmental and biochemical manipulation of the brain. Wow, and there's a source on that. I'm going to try to remember when I get to the bottom to look out for number 3. I want to know more about who said that quote. Let's say that again. I foresee the time when we shall have the means and therefore inevitably the temptation to manipulate the behavior and intellectual functioning of all the people through environmental and biochemical manipulation of their brain. And I have to point out that, speaking of social media, Facebook, they know how to manipulate your brain. They know how to provoke you in certain ways or put you into certain states, and that is the goal. Thus, it is an open question whether technology and science will in fact increase the options open to the individual. Under the headline, Study Terms Technology, a Boon to Individualism, the New York Times reported the preliminary conclusions of a Harvard project on the social significance of science. Its participants were quoted as concluding that most Americans have a greater range of personal choice, wider experience, and a more highly developed sense of self-worth than ever before. I feel like this is an advertisement. This may be so, but a judgment of this sort rests essentially on an intuitive, This may be so, but a judgment of the sort rests essentially on an intuitive and comparative insight into the present and past states of mind of Americans, right? How can you know? In this connection, a word of warning from an acute observer is highly relevant. It behaves us to, who are these people? He's like quoting people but not telling you who they are. They're like these abstract concepts. An acute observer is highly relevant, and he thinks, what is this structure? It behaves as to examine carefully the degree of validity as measured by actual behavior of the statement that a benefit of technology will be to increase the number of options and alternatives the individual can choose from. In principle, it could, in fact, the individual may use any number of psychological devices to avoid the discomfort of information overload and thereby keep the range of alternatives to which he responds much narrower than that which technology in principle makes available to him. In other words, the real questions are how the individual will exploit the options, to what extent he will intellectually and psychologically prepared to exploit them, and in what way society as a whole will create a favorable setting for taking advantage of these options. Their availability is not of itself proof of a greater sense of freedom or self-worth. Wow. That was a lot of newspeak. That was a lot of vagaries. But it does make me think of the quote-unquote choices you have, within a limited subset. Like the internet itself is infinite, but what can you actually do on the internet? You're still within the limits of that system, and it can seem overwhelming, and there's a big element of too much news, too much information. Our brains don't know how to process it because we're used to growing up in nature with a lot smaller data set. Right now, our data set is nearly infinite, essentially infinite, because you can't even parse it all, let alone process it all. Yeah. So the idea of giving people so many options, so much information, they have no idea even how to take it in. So we need to filter it for them. This reminds me of something from Metal Gear Solid 2 that you can look up as well, but there's a speech in that where there's an AI that's taken over the government that basically its primary goal is to just censor information and filter information because there's too much of it, and give people a specific view of themselves and the world by censoring information in a certain way so that they receive it a certain way. That's basically what he's talking about here. Instead of accepting himself as a spontaneous given, man in the most advanced societies may become more concerned with conscious self-analysis according to external explicit criteria. What is my IQ? What are my aptitudes, personality traits, capabilities, attractions, and negative features? In other words, external sources, please validate me, tell me who I am. The internal man, spontaneously accepting his own spontaneity, will more and more be challenged by the external man, consciously seeking his self-conscious image, and the transition from one to the other may not be easy. Wow, there's a lot in there. That's hard to even parse. So your internal sense of self will constantly be challenged by the external sense of self, other people. Consciously seeking his self-conscious image. What is my self-conscious image? Yeah, that's it. You want to find it. Who am I? And the transition from one to the other may not be easy. It will also give rise to difficult problems in determining the legitimate scope of social control. What is the scope of social control? The possibility of extensive chemical mind control, the danger of loss of individuality inherent in extensive transplantation, the feasibility of manipulating the genetic structure will call for the social definition of common criteria of use and restraint, as the previously cited writer put it. While the chemical affects the individual, the person is significant to himself and to society in his social context, at work, at home, at play. The consequences are social consequences. In deciding how to deal with such alterers of the ego of experience, and consequently alterers of the personality after the experience, in deciding how to deal with the changed human beings, we will have to face new questions such as, who am I? When am I who? Who are they in relation to me? That's interesting. that he talks about those as new ideas, and I feel like those are such comfortable questions to me and deep in my psyche, and I feel like other people can probably relate. That he's saying that wasn't normal at the time, but this would become normal. Who am I? When am I who? In other words, when I'm at home, I'm this way. When I'm at work, I'm this way. When I'm out with friends, I'm this way. Compartmentalization of the self into different boxes depending on where you're at and who are they in relation to me. Moreover, man will increasingly be living in a man-made and rapidly man-altered environments. I mean, really we are. By the end of the century, approximately 2/3 of the people in the advanced countries will live in cities. Urban growth has so far been primarily the byproduct of accidental economic convenience, of the magnetic attraction of population centers, of the flight of many from rural poverty and exploitation. It has not been deliberately designed to improve the quality of life. The impact of accidental cities is already contributing to the depersonalization of individual life, as the kinship structure, contracts, and enduring relationships of friendship become more difficult to maintain. Wow, so by being thrust in the cities, it's hard to maintain those sense of self and friendships and how you relate to your environment. Julian Huxley, that's funny. He mentioned, he was quoting the author up here, and I wondered if he was talking about Huxley. Wow. Anyway, Julian Huxley was perhaps guilty of only slight exaggeration when he warned that overcrowding in animals leads to distorted, neurotic, and downright pathological behavior. We can be sure that the same is true in principle of people. City life today is definitely leading to mass mental disease, to growing vandalism, and possible eruptions of mass violence. The problem of identity is likely to be complicated by a generation gap, intensified by the dissolution of traditional ties and values derived from extended family and enduring community relationships. The dialogue between the generations is becoming a dialogue of the deaf. It no longer operates within the conservative, liberal, or nationalist, internationalist framework. The breakdown in communication between the generations, so vividly evident during the student revolts of 1968, was rooted in the irrelevance of the old symbols to many younger people. Debate implies the acceptance of common frame of reference and language. Since these were lacking, debate became increasingly impossible. Isn't that very true today when you're trying to debate people or explain your side on the internet? It's becoming increasingly hard for people to even understand what you're saying or where you're coming from, because the words that you're using don't mean the same thing to them when they hear them, and vice versa. So you are essentially speaking different languages, and so you can never connect on any actual facts or points. Though currently the clash is over values, with many of the young rejecting those of their elders, who in turn contend with the young, have evaded the responsibility of articulating theirs. In the future, the clash between generations will be also over expertise. Within a few years, the rebels in the more advanced countries who today have the most visibility will be joined by a new generation making its claim to power in government and business, a generation trained to reason logically, as accustomed to exploiting electronic aids to human reasoning, as we have been to using machines to increase our own mobility, expressing itself in a language that functionally relates to these aids, accepting as routine managerial processes current innovations such as planning, programming, budgeting systems, PPBS, and the appearance in high business echelons of top computer executives. As the older elite defend what is considered not only its own vested interests, but more basically its own way of life, the resulting clash could generate even more intense conceptual issues. In other words, people like Elon Musk are coming in. Global absorption. But while our immediate reality is being fragmented, global reality increasingly absorbs the individual, involves him, and even occasionally overwhelms him. Communications are the obvious, already much discussed immediate cause. The changes wrought by communications and computers make for an extraordinarily interwoven society whose members are in continuous and close audiovisual contact, constantly interacting, instantly sharing the most intense social experiences, and prompted to increased personal involvement even in the most distant problems. I have to pause there, but that is exactly what social media is. It's shrinking the world to where we know about the tiniest, pettiest problem that's going on. It has nothing to do with us in a place we'd never go, people we would never normally interact with. And we're involved in all of this stuff that doesn't actually involve us and makes no difference in our actual lives. The new generation no longer defines the world exclusively on the basis of reading, either of ideologically structured analysis or of extensive descriptions. It also experiences and senses it vicariously through audio-visual communication. This form of communicating reality is growing more rapidly, especially in the advanced countries, than the traditional written medium, and it provides the principal source of news for the masses. By 1985, distance will be no excuse for delayed information from any part of the world to the powerful urban nerve centers that will mark the major concentrations of the people on Earth. I mean, and that was true by the 80s, but how even more true is it now? It's just like amplified and amplified and amplified. Global telephone dialing that in the more advanced states will include instant visual contact and a global television satellite system that will enable some states to invade private homes in other countries will create unprecedented global intimacy. And that is definitely happening. Things like YouTube, which I'm using now, I'm invading the rest of the country, the other countries, the world. The new reality, however, will not be that of a global village, right? Because you don't feel really intimate. It's a fake intimacy. McLuhan's striking analogy overlooks the personal stability, interpersonal intimacy, implicitly shared values, and traditions that were important ingredients of the primitive village. A more appropriate analogy is that of the global city, a nervous, agitated, tense, and fragmented web of interdependent relations. That interdependence, however, is better characterized by interaction than by intimacy. Instant communications are already creating something akin to a global nervous system, and it is nervous, isn't it? Occasional malfunctions of this nervous system because of blackouts or breakdowns will be all the more unsettling precisely because the mutual confidence and reciprocally reinforcing stability that are characteristics of village intimacy will be absent from the process of that nervous interaction. I'm going to skip some of these charts. They don't populate properly, but I'll scroll through them so you can pause and try and read them if you want. Man's intensified involvement in global affairs is reflected in and doubtless shaped by the changing character of what has until now been considered local news. Television has joined newspapers in expanding the immediate horizons of the viewer or reader to the point where local increasingly means national, and global affairs compete for attention on an unprecedented scale. And isn't that true? You would never thought of local as meaning the U.S., but now local means your state, your country, maybe even your continent, especially if you're European. And now you're constantly thinking about what's going on a global scale, what's going on over in Russia, what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in China and Japan. And there's there's so much trade going on that little problems that happen on that supply chain affect everybody in the world. And of course, COVID, everyone shut down. The entire world in lockstep shut down. Everyone was stopped. Everyone was connected in a global and local sense. Physical and moral immunity to foreign events cannot be, pause. I'm going to scroll through so you can see. Very effectively maintained under circumstances in which there are both a growing intellectual awareness of global interdependence and the electronic intrusion of global events into the home. And it is an intrusion. This condition also makes for a novel perception of foreign affairs. Even in the recent past, one learned about international politics through the study of history and geography, as well as by reading newspapers. This contributed to a highly structured, even rigid approach in which it was convenient to categorize events or nations in somewhat ideological terms. Today, however, foreign affairs intrude upon a child or adolescent in the advanced countries in the form of disparate, sporadic, isolated, but involving events. Catastrophes and acts of violence both abroad and at home become intermeshed, and though they may elicit either positive or negative reactions, these are no longer in the neatly compartmentalized categories of we and they. Television in particular contributes to a blurred, much more impressionistic, and also involved attitude toward world affairs. Anyone who teaches international politics senses a great change in the attitude of the young along these lines. And that's very true because you don't hear about other countries unless there's a horrible event going on. And it just becomes this chain of horrible events happening in random disparate places that you know nothing about. You don't know what it's really like there or what is going on there or that led up to an event. You just hear about the horrible event. And so you're getting these blurred, confusing narratives about what the world is and what's going on. It reminds me of what the Bible says about in the end there will be rumors of war and famine and all these things. And people say, oh, that's what we're going through now. We're hearing all these wars and all these, but all these things were going on all the time. They always have been. We've just never known about them. But now you know about every little thing that goes on everywhere, all over the world, and mostly only the horrible things, not the good, normal things that are going on most of the time. Because that's not newsworthy. Northeast, southwest, west-south. Such direct global intrusion and interaction, however, does not make for better understanding of our contemporary affairs, right? On the contrary, it can be argued that in some respects, understanding, in the sense of possessing the subjective confidence that one can evaluate events on the basis of some organized principle, is today much more difficult for most people to attain. Instant but vicarious participation in events evokes uncertainty, especially as it becomes more and more apparent that established analytical categories no longer adequately encompass the new circumstances. The science explosion, the most rapidly expanding aspect of our entire reality, growing more rapidly than population, industry, and cities, intensifies rather than reduces these feelings of insecurity. It is simply impossible for the average citizen and even for men of intellect to assimilate and meaningfully organize the flow of knowledge for themselves. It's too much. In every scientific field, complaints are mounting that the torrential outpouring of published reports, scientific papers, and scholarly articles, and the proliferation of professional journals make it impossible for individuals to avoid becoming either narrow-gauged specialists or superficial generalists. The sharing of new common perspectives thus becomes more difficult as knowledge expands. In addition, traditional perspectives, such as those provided by primitive myths or more recently by certain historically conditioned ideologies, can no longer be sustained. Yeah, so we're drowning in like a torrent of knowledge and information. Just again, I want to reference if people are interested in Metal Gear Solid 2, but that's exactly what that's about. The flow of information is too much. It needs to be controlled and manipulated to give the proper context to people so that they will continue to be controlled. The threat of intellectual fragmentation posed by the gap between the pace in the expansion of knowledge and the rate of its assimilation, we're not processing it fast enough, raises a perplexing question concerning the prospects for mankind's intellectual unity. In other words, people are going to be fragmented. Some people understand this, some people understand this, some people understand this, and they all have different perspectives. It has generally been assumed that the modern world, shaped increasingly by the industrial and urban revolutions, will become more homogeneous in its outlook. This may be so, but it could be that the homogeneity of insecurity and uncertainty and of intellectual anarchy. The result, therefore, would not necessarily be a more stable environment. So yeah, we'd all be the same, but we'd all be fractured in our own little corners. So we'd all be dealing with kind of the same problems, but we'd be separated in how we could communicate and understand what was going on and communicate with each other. Let's read one more section. This is some thick language to get through. Like I am struggling at parts to get through it, so I appreciate your patience at home. The ambivalent disseminator. I mean, even that title, like, it's hard to break down. Like, in other words, the person who's dispersing information, who is doing it in a way that he's not impassioned by it or manipulating it, or he doesn't care. I'm curious to see how he explains that, but even just think about the ambivalent disseminator. That could be like an AI. That's just like, it's ambivalent, it's disseminating information to people. I don't know. The United States is the principal global disseminator of the Technetronic revolution. It is we're getting to the heart of it now. It is American society that is currently having the greatest impact on all other societies, prompting a far-reaching cumulative transformation in their outlook and mores. At various stages in history, different societies have served as a catalyst for change by stimulating imitation and adaptation in others. What in the remote past Athens and Rome were to the Mediterranean world, or China to much of Asia, France has more recently been to Europe. French letters, arts, and political ideas exercised a magnetic attraction, and the French Revolution was perhaps the single most powerful stimulant to the rise of populist nationalism during the 19th century, which tied in with the American Revolution. In spite of its domestic tensions, indeed, in some respects because of them, the United States is the innovative and creative society of today. It is also a major disruptive influence on the world scene. In fact, communism, which many Americans see as the principal cause of unrest, primarily capitalizes on frustrations and aspirations, whose major source is the American impact on the rest of the world. The United States is the focus of global attention, emulation, envy, and admiration and animosity. No other society evokes feelings of such intensity. No other society's internal affairs, including America's racial and urban violence, are scrutinized with such attention. No other society's politics are followed with such avid interest. So much so that to many foreign nationals, United States domestic politics have become an essential extension of their own. No other society so massively disseminates its own way of life and its values by means of movies, television, multi-million copy, foreign editions of its national magazines, or simply by its products. No other society is the object of such contradictory assessments. Yeah, and I mean, that's just as true today, if not more so. I mean, everyone's talking about Trump everywhere, you know. Everyone talks about what goes on in America. What about 9/11? I mean, that was 30 years after this book was written. I mean, and that affected the whole world, and it's because of the media. It's because of the technotronic power that is behind what's happening in this country. What happens here is duplicated 1 billion times all over the world, on screens everywhere. The American impact. Initially, the impact of America on the world was largely idealistic. America was associated with freedom. Later, the influence became more materialistic. America was seen as the land of opportunity, crassly defined in terms of dollars. And that was a big propaganda twist, wasn't it, right? America is about freedom. No, America is about making money. When did that switch happen? And it wasn't overnight. Today, similar material advantages can be sought elsewhere at lower personal risk. And the assassinations of the Kennedys and Martin Luther King, as well as racial and social tensions, not to speak of Vietnam, have somewhat tarnished America's identification with freedom. Instead, America's influence is in the first instance scientific and technological, and it is a function of the scientific, technological, and educational lead of the United States, which I don't know that we really have anymore. But yeah, that is interesting that, our identification is so much more tarnished now that when you ask people what they think of America, it's definitely not freedom. It's probably like a fat guy now is probably what you think about. And that's not in small part due to the media as well. What are the most shows out there? It's like Homer Simpson, the dumb fat guy. And of course, we're all unhealthy here. Scientific and technological development is a dynamic process. It depends in the first instance on the resources committed to it, the personnel available for it, and the educational base that supports it. And last but not least, the freedom of scientific innovation in all four respects, the American position is advantageous. Contemporary America spends more on science and devotes greater resources to research than any other society. In addition, the American people enjoy access to education on a scale greater than that of most other advanced societies. At the beginning of the 1960s, the United States had more than 66% of its 15 to 19 age group enrolled in educational institutions. Comparable figures for France and West Germany were about 31% and 20% respectively. The combined populations of France, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom are equal to that of the United States, roughly 200 million, which is more over 300 now. But in the United States, 43% of college-age people are actually enrolled, whereas only 7 to 15% are enrolled in the four countries, Italy having the low figure and France the high. The Soviet percentage was approximately half that of the American. In actual numbers, there are close to 7 million college students in the United States and only about 1.5 million in the four European countries. At the more advanced level of the 20 to 24 age bracket, the American figure was 12%, while that for West Germany, the top Western European country, was about 5%. For the 5 to 19 age bracket, the American and the Western European levels were roughly about 80%, and the Soviet trailed with 57%. And I think that's interesting because, it only increased, but it also meant more and more that those are that's the tally of people that are the most brainwashed. They got the most indoctrination. It's not even about education anymore. As a result, the United States possesses a pyramid of educated social talent whose wide base is capable of providing effective support to the leading and creative apex. This is true even though in many respects American education is often intellectually deficient, especially in comparison with the more rigorous standards of Western European and Japanese secondary institutions. Nonetheless, the broad base of relatively trained peoples enables rapid adoption, development, and social application of scientific innovation or discovery. So that's interesting that he even lays that out, that the schools are developing what is going to be applied to society. If you want to read through these. While no precise estimates are possible, some experts have suggested that a present-day society would experience difficulties in rapid modernization if less than 10% of its population in the appropriate age bracket had higher education and less than 30% had lower education. Moreover, both the organizational structure and the intellectual atmosphere in the American scientific world favor experimentation and rapid social adaptation. In a special report on American scientific policies submitted in early 1968, a group of experts connected with OECD concluded that America's scientific and technical expertise is deeply rooted in American tradition and history. Competitiveness and the emphasis on quick exploitation have resulted in a quick spin-off of the enormous defense and space research efforts into the economy as a whole. in contrast to the situation in the Soviet Union, where the economic byproducts of almost as large-scale a research effort have so far been negligible. It is noteworthy that the Russians themselves estimate that the productivity of their researchers is only about half the Americans, and that innovations take 2 or 3 times as long to be put into effect. I mean, I'm just hearing that other countries are less willing to be guinea pigs for these new things that are being created and experimented on, and that Americans is basically the petri dish for their experiments, and we love it. This climate and the concomitant rewards for creative attainments results in a magnetic pull, the brain drain, from which America clearly benefits. America offers to many trained scientists, even from advanced countries, not only greater material rewards, but a unique opportunity for the maximum fulfillment of their talents. In other words, we're draining talent from other countries and pulling the smart people away from them and actually making other countries dumber. I don't know if that still is true, but that was definitely a huge thing that's talked about a lot. In the past, Western writers and artists gravitated primarily toward Paris. More recently, the Soviet Union and China have exercised some ideological attraction, but in neither case did it involve the movement of significant percentages of scientific elites. Though immigrating scientists initially think of America as a platform for creative work, and not as a national society to which they are transferring political allegiance, in most cases that allegiance is later obtained through assimilation. They just get used to living here. They like our McDonald's and Super Bowls. America's professional attraction for the global scientific elite is without historic precedent in either scale or scope. That's really important. If you want to read this. Though this attraction is likely to decline for Europeans, particularly because of America's domestic problems and partially because of Europe's own scientific advance, the success of J.J. Servan Schreiber's book, The American Challenge, reflects the basic inclination of concerned Europeans to accept the argument that the United States come closest to being the only truly modern society in terms of the organization and scale of its economic market, business administration, research and development, and education. In contrast, the structure of American government is viewed as strikingly antiquated. European sensitivity in this area is conditioned not only by fear of a widening American technological lead, but very much by the increasing presence on the European markets of large American firms that exploit their economic advantages of scale and superior organization to gradually acquire controlling interests in key frontier industries. The presence of these firms, like BlackRock, the emergence under their aegis of something akin to a new international corporate elite, the stimulation given by their presence to the adoption of American business practices and training, the deepening awareness that the so-called technology gap is, in reality, also a management and education gap, all have contributed both to a positive appraisal of American technostructure by the European business and scientific elite, and to the desire to adapt some of America's experience. Less tangible, but no less pervasive, is the American impact on mass culture. Youth mores and lifestyles. The higher the level of per capita income in a country, the more applicable seems the term Americanization. The richer you are in another country, the more you are just like Americans. This indicates that the external forms of characteristic contemporary American behavior are not so much culturally determined as they are an expression of a certain level of urban, technical, and economic development. Nonetheless, to the extent that these forms were, I think that's a typo. These forms were first applied in America and then exported abroad, they became symbolic of the American impact and of the innovation-emulation relationship prevailing between America and the rest of the world. Oh, that's a good one. Innovation-emulation relationship. Say that 5 times fast. What makes America unique in our time is that confrontation with the new is part of the daily American experience. For better or for worse, the rest of the world learns what is in store for it by observing what happens in the United States. Whether it be the latest scientific discoveries in space and medicine, or the electric toothbrush in the bathroom, pop art, or LSD, or 9/11, or COVID, air conditioning or air pollution, old age problems or juvenile delinquencies, TikTok or Facebook, the evidence is more elusive in such matters as style, music, values, social mores, but there too the term Americanization obviously implies a specific source. Similarly, foreign students returning from American universities have prompted an organizational and intellectual revolution in the academic life of their countries. Changes in the academic life of Germany, the United Kingdom, Japan, and more recently France, and to an even greater extent in the less developed countries, can be traced to the influence of American educational institutions. Given developments in modern communication, it is only a matter of time before students in Columbia University and, say, the University of Tehran will be watching the same lecturer simultaneously on YouTube. This is all the more likely because American society, more than any other country, communicates with the entire globe. Roughly 65% of all world communication originates in this country. Moreover, the United States has been most active in the promotion of global communication systems by means of satellites, and it is pioneering the development of a worldwide information grid, the Internet. It is expected that such a grid will come into being by around 1975. For the first time in history, the cumulative knowledge of mankind will be made accessible on a global scale, and it will be almost instantaneously available in response to demand in your pocket, on your phone. New imperialism? Question mark? All of these factors make for a novel relationship between the United States and the world. There are imperial overtones to it, and yet, in its essence, the relationship is quite different from the traditional imperial structure. It's the slavery that you choose. It's the, what did Huxley call it? The grateful servitude, the joyful servitude. To be sure, the fact that in the aftermath of World War II, a number of nations were directly dependent on the United States in matters of security, politics, economics, created a system that in many respects, including that of scale, superficially resembled the British, Roman, and Chinese empires of the past. The more than 1 million American troops stationed on some 400, it's over 800 now, major and almost 3,000 minor military bases scattered all over the globe, the 42 nations tied to the United States by security pacts, the American military missions training the officers and troops of many other national armies and terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, and the approximately 200,000 United States civilian government employees and foreign posts all make for striking analogies to the great classical imperial system, because America is the largest empire to ever exist on the planet, but most people don't think about it like that. Nevertheless, the concept of imperial shields rather than reveals a relationship between America and the world that is both more complex and more intimate. The imperial aspect of the relationship was, in the first instance, a transitory and rather spontaneous response to the vacuum created by World War II and to the subsequent felt threat from communism. Statists loves to talk about this vacuum. Moreover, it was neither formally structured nor explicitly legitimized. The empire was at most an informal system marked by the pretense of equality and non-interference. That's an interesting way to put it. This made it easier for the imperial attributes to recede once conditions changed. By the late 1960s, with a few exceptions, the earlier direct political military dependence on the United States had declined, often in spite of political efforts by the United States to maintain it, NATO. Its place had been filled by the more pervasive but less tangible influence of American economic presence and innovation, as they originated directly from the United States or were stimulated abroad by American foreign investment, the latter annually yielding a product considerably in excess of the gross national product of most major countries. In effect, American influence has a porous and almost invisible quality. It works through the interpenetration of economic institutions, the sympathetic harmony of political leaders and parties, the shared concepts of sophisticated intellectuals, the mating of bureaucratic interests. It is, in other words, something new in the world and not yet well understood. He also just described like the New World Order and the global government and how it works. You could say, in effect, the global government influence has a porous and almost invisible quality. It works through the interpenetration of economic institutions, the sympathetic harmony of political leaders and parties, the shared concepts of sophisticated intellectuals, the mating of bureaucratic interests. It is, in other words, something new in the world and not yet well understood. It's a new world order. It is the novelty of America's relationship with the world, complex, intimate, and porous, that the more orthodox, especially Marxist analysis of imperialism failed to encompass. To see that relationship, also America let's be honest, is incredibly Marxist and communist. And to pretend that America opposes communism is ridiculous. Like, America funds half the corporations here. It funds half the people that live here. We live in a socialist Marxist utopia. Like, I use the word utopia ironically, but it's definitely not free market, and it's certainly not capitalist. To see that relationship merely as the expression of an imperial drive is to ignore the part played in it by the crucial dimensions of the technological scientific revolution. That revolution not only captivates the imagination and Imagineers at Disney and of mankind who can fail to be moved by the spectacle of man reaching the moon. Oh yeah, it's like he's winking in there. Who wasn't moved by that amazing going to the moon, which I know is bullshit, but inescapably compels imitation of the more advanced by the less advanced and stimulates the export of new techniques, methods, and organizational skills from the former to the latter. There is no doubt that this results in an asymmetrical relationship, but the content of that asymmetry must be examined before it is called imperialism. Like every society, America no doubt prefers to be more rather than less advanced. Yet it is also striking that no other country has made so great an effort, governmentally and privately, through business and especially through foundations, NGOs, to export its know-how, to make public its space findings, to promote new agricultural techniques, to improve educational facilities, to control population growth, to improve healthcare, and so on. All of this has imperial overtones, and yet it is misleading to label it as such. All of this seems like empire, but you'd be mistaken. It's love. Indeed, unable to understand fully what is happening in their own society, Americans find it difficult to comprehend the global impact that society has had in its unique role as disseminator of the Technetronic revolution. This impact is contradictory. It both promotes and undermines American interests as defined by American policymakers. It helps to advance the cause of cooperation on a larger scale, even as it disrupts existing social or economic fabrics. It both lays the groundwork for well-being and stability and enhances the forces working for instability and revolution. God, this sounds like the Hegelian dialectic. They're playing both sides along every path. Unlike traditional imperialistic powers, which relied heavily on the principle of divide et imperia, divide and conquer, practiced with striking similarity by the British in India and more recently by the Russians in Eastern Europe, America has striven to promote regionalism both in Europe and in Latin America. Yet in so doing, it is helping to create larger entities that are more capable of resisting its influence and of competing with it economically. Implicitly and often explicitly modeled on the American pattern, modernization makes for potentially greater economic well-being. But in the process, it disrupts existing institutions, undermines prevailing mores, and stimulates resentment that focuses directly on the source of change, America. The result is an acute tension between the kind of global stability and order that America subjectively seeks and the instability, impatience, and frustration that America unconsciously promotes. The United States has emerged as the first global society in history. It is a society increasingly difficult to delineate in terms of its cultural and economic boundaries. Moreover, it is unlikely that in the foreseeable future, America will cease to exercise the innovative stimulus that is characteristic of its current relationship with the world. By the end of this century, extrapolating from the current trends, only some 13 countries are likely to reach the 1965 level of the per capita gross national product of the United States. Unless there is major scientific and economic stagnation or a political crisis, see Part 4. At the end of the century, America will still be a significant force for global change, whether or not the dominant subjective mood is pro or anti-American. I wonder where we're at today. Thanks for tuning in. We will read the next section, Global Ghettos, next time. Peace.